Staff Sergeant Robert Dietrich tracked anti-aircraft tracers from the control tower at Yonton Airfield at 2100 on May 24, 1945. Below him, 3 runways held more than 150 aircraft: Corsairs, Hellcats, privateer patrol bombers, C-47 transports. 70,000 gallons of aviation fuel filled the dumps along the taxiways, and 12 Japanese bombers packed with 136 suicide commandos were already airborne, 4 hours north, heading straight for this field. Dietrich was 28, from Cincinnati, a tower operator with Marine Aircraft Group 31. He had worked Yonton since April 7th, the day MAG-31 flew 80 Corsairs ashore from the escort carriers Sitco Bay and Breton. In 7 weeks, the airfield had grown into the busiest base on the island. Marine and Army Air Force squadrons flew around the clock. Day fighters hunted kamikazes over the radar picket line. Night fighters ran intercepts after dark. Ground crews rearmed and refueled planes through the night to get them airborne again by dawn. First Lieutenant Maynard Kelly worked the radio beside him, 22 years old, a night fighter pilot with VMF N-533, Black Max Killers, under Lieutenant Colonel Marion Magruder. Kelly had earned his wings in 1943 and shipped overseas with Magruder's unit. On Okinawa, he had flown only a few combat missions since arriving 3 weeks earlier. Tonight, he had the duty watch. A third Marine worked alongside them. Together, the 3 of them could see all 3 runways and the full sweep of the field. Dietrich knew what Yonton meant to the fleet. Every morning, Corsairs rolled out and climbed toward the picket stations where Navy destroyers waited for the next kamikaze wave. Fighters from this field intercepted nearly 60% of the suicide aircraft before they reached the ships. If Yonton went dark, even for a day, the kamikazes would get through. For weeks, Japanese bombers had hit the airfield almost every night. The pattern never changed. Aircraft at high altitude, bombs across the field, the guns of the 1st Provisional Anti-Aircraft Artillery Group answering with walls of tracers. The men on the ground knew the rhythm. Tonight followed the same script. Just after 2000, bombers appeared over Yonton and neighboring Ieshima, high and fast. Between 2110 and 2205, 2 runs came through. Their bombs hit nothing critical. The firing slowed. Kelly told Dietrich he would pay $50 to get up there and take a shot. Minutes later, 3 bombers crossed over the field at once. Kelly raised his voice. The stakes, he said, had just gone up. The high-altitude runs were a screen. 50 conventional bombers had been sent ahead to pull the American night fighters and anti-aircraft guns away from what was coming behind them. 5 surviving Ki-21 transports, the type the Allies called Sally, were closing on Okinawa at 150 feet, low enough to slip beneath the radar net. Captain Chuichi Suwabe commanded the flight crews. Each transport carried a dozen commandos from the Juretsu Kuteitai, trained by Captain Michiro Okuyama for this single mission, armed with submachine guns, satchel charges, and phosphorus grenades. Their orders? Belly land on the runway, destroy every plane within reach, and fight until dead. What happened next turned this airfield into a ground war where every mechanic grabbed a rifle. If this story grips you, hit like and subscribe. You will not want to miss the rest. At 22:25, Dietrich spotted a twin-engine aircraft skimming the treetops at the north end of the field. It was not bombing. It was not climbing. It was lined up with the main runway, dropping fast, gear up. Then 3 more appeared behind it. The anti-aircraft gunners of the 1st Provisional Anti-Aircraft Artillery Group had been firing at high-altitude bombers for 2 hours. Their barrels were hot, their crews were tired, and the aircraft now sliding across the treetops at 22:25 were not following any pattern they had seen before. Dietrich watched from the tower as the lead Sally came in at rooftop height from the north. Marine gunners on the perimeter swung their weapons down and opened fire. Tracers stitched across the dark at nearly flat angles. The first transport shuddered, rolled left, and came apart before it reached the runway threshold. Burning wreckage scattered across the scrub north of the field. 5 minutes later, 3 more appeared, all low, all heading for the runway with their landing gear up. The guns along the eastern and western edges of the field fired simultaneously. One Sally caught a burst in its left engine and cartwheeled into the dirt south of the airstrip. A second absorbed dozens of rounds and pancaked into the taxiway, breaking apart on impact. The third took a direct hit from a 40mm gun. Its left wing separated from the fuselage in midair. That wing fell on a searchlight position manned by Corporal Lavat O'Miller and Private Nathaniel Collinsworth from the 16th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion. The severed wing struck the emplacement and buried both men. Neither survived. They were the first Americans killed that night, not by enemy fire, but by 3 tons of aluminum falling out of the sky. Dietrich saw the explosions from the tower. He saw the burning wrecks and the tracers crisscrossing the field. But what he did not see, what none of them saw, was the 5th Sally. It came in lower than the others, wheels up, no running lights. It cleared the anti-aircraft positions at the south end of the field and touched down on the northeast-southwest runway at approximately 22:30. The belly of the transport scraped across crushed coral, throwing sparks and dust in a trail 200 yards long. It slid to a stop roughly 100 meters from the control tower. Dietrich was the first to see what came out. The nose section of the Sally cracked open, and figures dropped to the ground. 10, maybe 12 men carrying submachine guns and canvas satchels. They moved fast, no hesitation, no pause to regroup. They split into pairs and ran toward the nearest line of parked aircraft. Kelly saw them from the tower at the same moment. He did not stay at the radio. He grabbed his service revolver, ran down the tower ladder, climbed into a jeep, and drove straight toward the belly-landed transport. A 22-year-old pilot with a sidearm, heading alone into a group of commandos armed with automatic weapons and demolition charges. First Lieutenant Clark Campbell heard the crash from across the field. Campbell was with VMFN 542, the Tigers, a night fighter squadron that had been at Yaunton since the first week of April. 28 years old, he knew the field layout in the dark. He knew where the aircraft were parked, where the fuel dump sat, where the maintenance crews slept. When the Sally skidded to a stop, Campbell understood immediately that this was not a bombing run. Someone had just landed troops on their airfield. Campbell grabbed Technical Sergeant Chandler Beasley and started moving toward the flight line. What they had was a sidearm each and the knowledge that 150 American aircraft were sitting in the open with their fuel tanks full. The first grenade detonated against a Corsair 60 seconds after the commandos hit the ground. Then a second. Then the fuel dump along the eastern taxiway erupted in a column of fire visible from 5 miles out. The commandos moved through the parked aircraft in pairs, exactly as they had rehearsed. One man would clamp a magnetic charge or satchel onto the fuselage of a larger plane, a privateer, a C-47, while the second threw phosphorus grenades at the smaller fighters on either side. They worked from east to west along the flight line, away from the belly-landed Sally and toward the densest concentration of Corsairs. Dietrich tracked the fires from the tower. One Corsair was burning near the northeast runway, then a second. A privateer patrol bomber erupted 30 yards further down the line. Its fuel tanks caught, and the wings collapsed inward. The eastern fuel dump was already a wall of flame. 70,000 gallons of aviation gasoline had gone up in the first 2 minutes, and the light from the blaze turned the entire airfield into a bright orange theater where every aircraft, every vehicle, and every man on the ground cast hard black shadows. Private Jack Kelly, a fighter squadron mechanic, had been working on a Corsair engine when the alarm sounded at 22:30. He ran for the nearest bunker and threw himself inside. A dozen other ground crew were already there. None of them had weapons. The belly-landed Sally sat roughly 100 meters from their position. Through the bunker entrance, Kelly could hear grenades detonating against aircraft and the sharp crack of submachine gun fire. He could see the glow of burning fuel reflecting off the underside of low clouds. All they could do was listen and wait, and hope that someone with a rifle would arrive before the commandos found them. Kelly reached the area around the Sally in his jeep. He drew his service revolver and fired at the nearest figure he could identify in the firelight. The details of what happened next depend on which account survived the night. Dietrich, watching from the tower, saw Kelly engage, and then saw him fall. One source records that Kelly turned on a searchlight to illuminate the raiders and was hit by automatic weapons fire. Another records that he drove into the area and was killed by small arms at close range. What is confirmed is that First Lieutenant Maynard C. Kelly was fatally shot within minutes of leaving the tower. He was the first Marine killed by enemy fire on Yaunton that night. Technical Sergeant Roderick Wogan was somewhere near the flight line when the commandos came through. Wogan was also with the 2nd Marine Aircraft Wing. He was killed by small arms fire in the same opening minutes. The circumstances of his death were not recorded in detail. In the chaos of a night ground battle among burning aircraft, individual actions disappeared into smoke and noise. The problem was not courage. The problem was that Yanton was an airfield, not a defensive position. The men on the ground were pilots, mechanics, armorers, radio technicians. They serviced and flew aircraft. They did not run patrols. They did not dig fighting positions around the taxiways. Their weapons were locked in unit armories or stowed in tents. The anti-aircraft gunners had been shooting at aircraft in the sky. Now the enemy was on the ground, mixed in among their own planes, and the big guns could not depress low enough to engage targets running between parked Corsairs. Campbell and Beasley were pushing through this chaos toward the flight line. They could hear the detonations moving west, which meant the commandos were working deeper into the heart of the field, toward the largest cluster of aircraft and the main fuel storage. If the raiders reached the western dispersal area, where the night fighters of VMF 533 were parked, the damage would cripple Yanton's ability to intercept kamikazes for days. Campbell started pulling men out of bunkers and tents, mechanics, armorers, anyone with hands. He told them to find a weapon and get to the flight line. What Campbell found on the flight line was worse than the fires. The men who had grabbed weapons were shooting at anything that moved. Tracers flew across the taxiways in every direction. Rifles cracked from bunkers, from behind revetments, from the edges of the runways. In the shifting orange light of burning aircraft and fuel, every shadow looked like a Japanese commando, and every Marine who moved between the planes risked being shot by his own side. The friendly fire started within minutes of the first grenade. Anti-aircraft crews on the perimeter, unable to see what was happening among the parked aircraft, opened up with 20mm cannons at ground level, rounds designed to destroy aircraft at altitude, now ripping through the flight line where Marines were running for cover. Men in foxholes along the runways fired at silhouettes they could not identify. Mechanics who had never handled a weapon under stress emptied magazines into the dark and reloaded without knowing what they had hit. Dietrich watched it from the tower. Muzzle flashes sparkled across the field in a full circle. Some pointed inward at the commandos, others pointed at other Americans. The tower itself drew fire. Rounds cracked through the wooden walls. Dietrich and the third operator dropped below the window line and stayed low. They could still see the fires, but they could no longer stand upright without risking a bullet from their own guns. A significant number of the 18 Marines wounded that night were hit by American fire. The after-action reports acknowledged it without assigning blame. In the dark, on a field full of explosions and burning fuel, with an unknown number of enemy soldiers moving through the aircraft, there was no front line. There was no safe direction to shoot. Every man with a weapon made his own decision about what was a target and what was a friend, and some of those decisions were wrong. Campbell understood that the shooting would not stop until someone imposed order. He and Beasley moved along the flight line, not just looking for commandos, but pulling Marines into groups, assigning sectors, stopping men from firing into areas where other Americans were working. This was not a skill Campbell had trained for. Night fighter pilots learned to track radar contacts and close on enemy aircraft in the dark. They did not learn small unit infantry tactics. But Campbell had one advantage. He knew the physical layout of Yanton better than any infantryman could, because he had taxied across it, walked it, and worked on it every day for 7 weeks. He organized the men he could reach into a rough skirmish line facing west, the direction the commandos had been moving. Beasley anchored one end. Technical Sergeant Jerome Rubel from VMF Nor 542 took a position where he could direct fire against a cluster of enemy movement near the eastern fuel dump. Rubel spotted one of the raiders placing a charge on a transport aircraft and shot him before the charge detonated. The commandos were still moving. Another Corsair caught fire near the western dispersal. Then a C-47 transport. The raiders placed their charges methodically. Satchels clamped to fuselages, phosphorus grenades tossed into cockpits, incendiaries wedged into wheel wells. They had rehearsed every step on mock-ups of American aircraft back on Kyushu. Each man had been trained to destroy at least 2 planes before he died. And dying was the plan. There was no extraction, no rendezvous point, no second transport coming to pick them up. By 2300, 9 aircraft were fully destroyed and the fire count was still climbing. 29 more had taken blast or fragment damage. Campbell's improvised line was holding the eastern half of the field, but scattered shots and explosions still came from the western dispersal area. Somewhere in the smoke and burning fuel, commandos were still alive, still planting charges, still carrying out a mission that would end only when every one of them was dead. The stench hit first. Burning rubber, aviation gasoline, and something else. The thick, sweet smell of scorched aluminum skin peeling off airframes in the heat. The smoke from the fuel dump hung low across the field in the windless air and mixed with the haze of phosphorus grenades. Dietrich, still on the tower floor, breathed through his sleeve. Visibility dropped to 50 yards in places, then opened briefly when a new explosion pushed the smoke aside, then closed again. Campbell's skirmish line moved west through the smoke in short advances. A few steps forward. Stop. Listen. Watch for movement against the glow of burning aircraft. Then forward again. The Marines on the line were mechanics and armorers who had fired weapons on qualification ranges and nowhere else. They gripped rifles they had pulled from armory racks 10 minutes earlier. Some still had grease on their hands from the aircraft they had been servicing when the alarm sounded. The commandos had split into smaller groups, 2s and 3s, spread across an area nearly half a mile wide. Each group operated independently. They had no radio communication with each other and did not need any. Every man carried phosphorus grenades that burned at 2,000 degrees. Every man carried a pistol with one purpose everyone understood. Near the western dispersal area, a group of 2 or 3 raiders had reached a line of corsairs that had not yet been hit. A satchel charge detonated against the wing root of the nearest fighter. The fuel in the wing tanks caught. Fire ran along the ground beneath the aircraft and jumped to the next corsair parked 20 feet away. In 90 seconds, 3 fighters were burning in a chain that lit up the western end of the field. Rubel and his group pushed toward the sound. They found one raider crouched beside a C-47 transport, working to fix a charge to the landing gear. Rubel fired, and the man dropped. But the charge was already set. The C-47 blew apart minutes later, scattering debris across the taxiway and forcing Rubel's group to fall back and find a new approach. The problem was time. Every minute the commando stayed alive was another aircraft lost. Campbell could count the fires from where he stood, at least a dozen burning airframes spread across both sides of the main runway. The eastern fuel dump was gone. If the western dump went up, Yonton would lose its entire reserve of aviation gasoline. Somewhere overhead, Lieutenant Colonel Marion Magruder and his night fighters from VMF in 533 were running low on fuel. They had been airborne when the attack began, hunting Japanese bombers in the dark. Now they needed to land. Magruder radioed Yonton Tower. Dietrich and the surviving operator could see burning wreckage on at least 2 of the 3 runways. They diverted Magruder's Hellcats to Kadena, 5 miles south, to refuel and stand by. On the ground, the hunting continued in the dark. Campbell sent pairs of Marines along the taxiways to check each revetment and each parked aircraft for raiders. Every destroyed plane they passed was a potential hiding place. A commando could be crouched behind a collapsed wing section or inside a burned-out fuselage, waiting. One Marine would approach while another covered. They cleared each wreck the way infantrymen clear rooms, except these men had never cleared anything in their lives. By midnight, the firing had thinned, fewer detonations, longer silences between shots. Either the commandos were dead or they had gone to ground. Campbell had no way to know which. What he knew was that his line had reached the western fuel dump and it was still intact. That was the one thing that had gone right since 2230. Campbell changed tactics after midnight. Instead of pushing the skirmish line forward, he set up stationary positions at the key points that still mattered: the western fuel dump, the surviving cluster of night fighters near VMF in 533's dispersal, and the approaches to the main runway. If any commandos were still moving, They would have to cross open ground to reach another target. And on that open ground, against men who are now dug in and watching, they would be visible against the firelight. Beasley held the position nearest the western dispersal. Rubel covered the southern taxiway. Campbell moved between them, checking fields of fire, adjusting positions, making sure no one shot at friendlies. The random firing that had ripped across the field for the past 90 minutes had mostly stopped. The men on the line understood the system now. Hold your sector, watch your front, do not fire unless you can identify a target. It had taken an hour and a half to turn a crowd of panicking airfield personnel into something that functioned like a defensive perimeter. Campbell had done it without infantry manuals, without radio contact with higher command, and without knowing how many of the enemy were still alive. The answer came in pieces. A raider was spotted near the northeast runway at approximately 0100, crouched behind the wreckage of the belly-landed Sally. A Marine fired, the figure dropped and did not move. 20 minutes later, another was found inside a burned-out C-47 on the eastern taxiway. He had a pistol and one remaining grenade. He did not surrender. Marines shot him where he sat. One by one, through the early morning hours, the commandos were found. Some had crawled into drainage ditches along the runway edges. Some had wedged themselves into the gaps between revetment walls. Some were already dead, killed by blast fragments from their own charges or by gunfire during the opening chaos. None of them attempted to give up. None called out. None raised their hands. Dietrich remained in the tower through the entire night. When the firing around the tower subsided enough for him to stand, he resumed scanning the field. At one point in the early hours, he spotted a figure moving near the southern end of the main runway, the last raider he could identify from his elevated position. He fired. The figure went down. Dietrich would later tell combat correspondent Sergeant Claude Knupp that he had fired at the first commando he saw and at the last one still moving on the field. Knupp himself spent the night in a foxhole near the airfield perimeter. A former sports editor from Anderson, South Carolina, assigned to Marine Aircraft Group 31 as a combat correspondent. He could hear the explosions, the gunfire, the anti-aircraft rounds cooking off in the heat of burning aircraft, confusion, indiscriminate shooting, and fire in every direction. In the days that followed, Knupp tracked down Dietrich and other tower personnel and recorded their accounts on onion skin paper, the only detailed first-person narratives of the night that survived the war. At 0300, Magruder's Hellcats received clearance to return from Kadena. The main runway had been partially cleared. Marines had pushed the largest pieces of wreckage off the coral surface by hand and with a single bulldozer that still ran. Magruder brought his night fighters in between the fires, landing on a strip lit not by runway lights, but by the glow of burning Corsairs on either side. Dawn came at 0530. The smoke that had hidden the field through the night now lifted into a gray column visible from ships offshore. Campbell's Marines were still in position. The firing had stopped. But somewhere on the airfield or in the brush beyond its edges, at least one commando was still unaccounted for. Daylight revealed the cost. Campbell walked the flight line at 0600 with Beasley and counted what was left. 3 Corsairs burned to their frames, nothing but blackened steel tubing and collapsed landing gear sitting in pools of melted aluminum. 2 privateer patrol bombers destroyed, their 4-engine fuselages split open by satchel charges. 4 C-47 transports gutted. 29 additional aircraft carried blast damage, fragment holes, or scorching. 22 Corsairs, 3 Hellcats, 2 more privateers, 2 more transports. The eastern fuel dump was a charred crater. Marine infantry arrived from positions south of the airfield at first light and began the systematic clearing that Campbell's improvised force had started 7 hours earlier. They moved through the wreckage in fire teams, 4 men at a time, covering each other as they checked every burned airframe, every revetment, every drainage ditch. They found bodies. 69 Japanese dead lay scattered across the field and the surrounding scrub. Some had been killed by gunfire, some by their own explosives. Some had used their pistols on themselves when they had nothing left to destroy. No prisoners were taken. None had attempted to surrender. The belly-landed Sally sat where it had stopped, 100 meters from the tower. 11 bodies were recovered in and around the transport, including the crew. A map taken from the body of one of the officers showed Yonton's layout in precise detail. Large red crosses marked the exact parking positions of VMF N-533's Hellcats and another red cross on Lieutenant Colonel Magruder's tent. The commandos had known exactly where the night fighters were. They had not reached them. On the American side, 4 Marines were dead. First Lieutenant Maynard Kelly and Technical Sergeant Roderick Wogan killed by enemy small arms fire. Corporal Levate All Miller and Private Nathaniel Collinsworth killed when the severed wing of a Sally crushed their searchlight position. 27 more were wounded. A significant number of those wounds came from friendly fire, Marines shooting at Marines in the dark among burning planes. The runway was cleared by 0740. Engineers with bulldozers pushed wreckage off the coral surface. Ordnance crews swept for unexploded charges. Ground crews towed damaged aircraft to repair areas. By 0800, the first Corsairs were rolling down the main runway and climbing toward the radar picket stations where the fleet still waited for the next wave of kamikazes. Yonton was operational again less than 10 hours after the commandos had landed on it. The speed of the recovery told the strategic truth. Operation Gigu had inflicted visible damage. 38 aircraft hit, a fuel dump destroyed, 4 men killed. But it had not shut down the airfield for more than a single morning. The Corsairs that burned were replaced within the week. The fuel was resupplied. The night fighters that the commandos had specifically targeted were untouched. The 60% interception rate against kamikazes continued without interruption. For Kelly, there would be a Navy Cross, posthumous. Technical Sergeant Jerome Rubel received a Bronze Star for directing fire under chaos, killing at least 1 raider and protecting the men in his section. Campbell and Beasley received no decorations recorded in the available sources. They had simply done what needed doing and went back to flying night missions the following evening. 2 Marines from the 8th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Battalion found a Japanese officer sleeping in the jungle near the airfield after the battle was over. They shot him. Both were court-martialed. The war had rules, even on Okinawa, even after a night like that. The last commando was found at 12:55 on May 25th, a quarter-mile behind the headquarters building of Marine Aircraft Group 31. Marines shot him in the brush. He had survived nearly 15 hours on an airfield crawling with armed men who were looking for him. He did not surrender. 1 raider was never found at Yonton at all. American intelligence later confirmed that a single member of the Juretsu force made it off the airfield, crossed the active battlefield of southern Okinawa, and reached the headquarters of the Japanese 32nd Army around June 12, 18 days after the raid. His name was not recorded in American sources. His report changed nothing. The 32nd Army was already collapsing. Okinawa fell on June 21st, but the Japanese High Command considered the raid a success. Within weeks, planners drew up Operation Ken-Go, 60 transports carrying 900 commandos aimed at the B-29 bases on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The raids were scheduled for the nights of August 19th through 23rd. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. The operation was canceled. The war was over. Staff Sergeant Robert Dietrich went home to Cincinnati. His account of the night, recorded by combat correspondent Claude Canup on onion skin paper, sat in Canup's personal binders for decades. Canup, the former sports editor from South Carolina, returned to journalism after the war and kept his Pacific dispatches in a collection that his family preserved after his death in 1999. The Dietrich interview and the story of the tower that night were rediscovered by Canup's daughter Linda and published in Naval History magazine in 2010. 65 years after the raid. Lieutenant Colonel Marion Magruder continued to command VMF 533 through the end of the Okinawa campaign. His squadron, Black Max Killers, was credited with shooting down 5 of the incoming bombers on the night of the raid, the night fighters that the Juretsu commandos had specifically targeted but never reached. Clark Campbell and Chandler Beasley went back to night fighter operations with VMF N-542. The squadron earned a Presidential Unit Citation for its actions on Okinawa between April and August 1945. Major Robert Porter and Captain Wallace Sigler became the first night fighter aces on the island during that same tour. The Tigers flew from the same field that Campbell had defended on foot with a pistol and a group of mechanics. Maynard Kelly was buried in the Marine Cemetery on Okinawa. 22 years old, raised by his grandparents in Seattle, commissioned in 1943. He had been on the island for 3 weeks. He was the first man on Yaunton to fight back. Corporal Levate Miller and Private Nathaniel Collinsworth remain among the lesser-known casualties of that night, anti-aircraft gunners who never saw the enemy reach the ground. The field where all of this happened is gone. Yaunton reverted to farmland after the American occupation ended. There are no runways left, no tower, no revetments. The crushed coral that Kelly's Jeep drove across in the dark has been covered by soil and crops for 70 years. But the night of May 24, 1945, happened. Mechanics picked up rifles. A pilot drove a Jeep into a firefight with a revolver. A tower operator watched it all from a wooden box above the flames and lived to tell it. They deserve to be remembered. If this story stayed with you, hit the like button. It tells us these histories matter. Subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss one. We have got more missions like this coming. Now, here is a question. What would you have done? You are on that airfield. You are a mechanic. You have never fired a weapon in combat. And a transport full of enemy commandos just landed 100 meters from where you are standing. Drop your answer in the comments, and while you are there, tell us where you are watching from, country, city, wherever you are. Every comment helps this channel reach more people who care about keeping these stories alive. These men did not fight for headlines. They fought because the field was theirs, and someone had to hold it.